But now we're going to bring it back to specifically the FLLITE approach. And one aspect that we haven't talked about is assessment. Assessment is, of course, a key element for any educators, particularly in the United States, I would say, in any event, as far as how we show what students are learning and what they have achieved. So when we talk about formative and summative assessment, the FLLITE approach doesn't so much provide new formats for assessing as it does provide new criteria. So because we're expanding the paradigm of the literal to include the literal and the literary, we need to now come up with different criteria for assessing the literary. Essentially, languocultural skills are at the core of this approach. And so as a way of just giving a very broad sense of that, what are languocultural skills and strategies? They broadly relate to two things. One is interpreting gray areas of meaning. So these are the foregrounded meanings in language, imagery, and cultural contexts. That's the lingua part of languocultural. And the cultural part has to do with in everything that ties to gaining ownership of an emerging identity as an authentic user of a foreign language. So these are these transcultural competencies that the MLA report of 2007 spoke of. One thing has come under a fair amount of critique in more recent years is the use of comprehension questions. And it's under critique largely because when you think about it, it's always in relationship to this direct informational content-based comprehension, which is not touching on how meaning is made really in a text or in most texts. So it's not to say that let's throw out comprehension questions. What we need to do now is to think, how can we expand or adapt our comprehension questions to be able to address the literary? So let's go back for a moment to this poem yesterday. And this first line of the poem, I've known in the inexorable sadness of pencils. And what's interesting is that if you get the chance, I would really recommend that you read the poem, and you'll see better what it is that these questions do. But let's first go over the questions. So one thing is that the teacher can actually explicitly key the students into the foregrounded elements, in this case the first line of the poem, and allow that to be a staging point for the student to then test their to test the comprehension of the student's negotiation of meaning in the poem. So you ask, why are the pencils personified? Remember, we mentioned three things. There was personification, there was the use of inexorable, and then there was the extra patterning of the phonemes. So, comprehension question, why are the pencils personified? Why is the sadness inexorable, impossible to stop or prevent? How does this sadness relate to the title, dolor? There's a repetition of the sounds. Are there other examples of repetition of sounds in the poem? If so, how does this help to develop the theme of the poem? And then, how does this poem make you feel and why? Cite evidence from the text. What do you think this poem is about? Because that's really ultimately the question is, what is the poem about, right? Cite evidence from the text. So what's interesting, I'll just give you a little heads up if you don't get the chance to look at the poem. It's a poem about the oppressive nature of administrative office work. And so in fact, you have this personification of the objects that are typically in an office. And you have this patterning, this rhythm and this patterning of sounds that creates this underlying, almost oppressive beat that you're not consciously, unless you're keyed into it, you're not consciously thinking of. But the end of the poem then turns from the personification of these things to how it impacts the people who are, essentially caught in this environment that is, limiting their creative and expressive lives, right? So everything is right there in the first line of the poem to give you access to making meaning out of the poem. So that's one way that you might want to test the student's comprehension. Key them into those elements, have them use that for making sense of the poem. Another example is coming, I'll just give you a quick example coming out of the second chapter, 1B actually, chapter from from my textbook. Here again, and I realized only after I put this together that there seems to be an overemphasis on poems. Poems just are such a nice way, such an easy way to bring out the literary in a text. But what's interesting about this poem, L'accent grave by Prévert, is that it's actually in the form of a play script. Just like the dialogue poem that we saw yesterday that doesn't look like a poem, this poem doesn't look like a poem. It's in the play script format. And it basically plays against two characters: the teacher of a classroom, of a school, age classroom, maybe middle school, high school kind of classroom, and a student whose name is Hamlet. Now, this is a poem in French, right? But it's really the conflict between Hamlet, who represents the kind of free thinking of a student, of a young person, and the conformism that the teacher represents. So the questions that I ask students in this part of the poem: what phrase does the teacher repeat 3 times in the text? The teacher makes an error of capitalization in French that a reader can see but would not be heard if spoken. What is the error? And I give them information about the use of Platonic ideals. So what's interesting is that in this poem, the word in French, when you use the nouns for nationalities adjectively, so if you talk about the language, if you say he's a Frenchman, right, then it's capitalized. But if you say, if you talk about the language, he speaks French, it's not capitalized as it is in English. So that's one of the things that students at the very beginning levels have to understand, is the difference of capitalization. In this poem, the teacher, who is the personification of conformity, at one point says, speak en français, speak in French, because Hamlet keeps answering in English. So, en français, but he capitalizes the français. Now, Prévert was a master of wordplay. And here's the interesting thing. In 2 introductory level textbooks that I've seen and that I've had to work with in the past, they edited out that capitalization en français. So my question is, do they assume that it's a typographical error? Or do they think, oh, this is too complicated? I mean, I don't know what they think, but they edit it out. And here for me is this wonderful opportunity of the literary. So by, in fact, in investing Platonic ideal form, what the teacher, the character of the teacher, what it's saying is, he thinks that the French language is sacrosanct, that you can't touch it, that it is this perfect ideal, and that this student is messing around, right, with this, pure form. So these are just fascinating little windows, and so it does make the point, when you're working with a text in a textbook at the elementary levels, check to make sure that it is the same as the original, because textbook authors and publishing companies will often simplify text in ways that are not obvious at all. So the third question is, what do these instances of repetition and unusual capitalization tell us about the teacher's way of thinking, right? How would you characterize him? So getting students to plug into those playful dimensions brings a whole level of understanding of this text, rather than the comprehension questions that are in the textbook that basically give the answers, right? Point to, without the students going through this process of interpretation. I wanted to make clear that at the lower levels in the FLLITE approach, it is understood that it is okay to use L1, in this case, we're assuming English, for this kind of work initially, for the reading, to help students, because this involves meta-level thinking that students don't have the linguistic competence yet in their foreign language. So it's okay for unpacking that meaning in this way that's going to then become useful for them for production when you get to the redesigning assignment.
The move from communicative language teaching to multiliteracies. Multiliteracies, also part of it is to reframe language, to move from a native speaker kind of model to a multilingual model. So we want to kind of raise to the students' awareness what it means to be a multilingual, that you have 2 languages and that your new language will affect your L1, the L2 affects the L1, and the L1 affects the L2. You are not supposed to try to replicate the native speaker, no. So that's a big shift. We were talking about lots of shifts.
Yeah.
And the other thing too is, we were talking about communicative language teaching, That was a straw man argument. You know what a straw man argument is? It does. It builds up the straw man and knocks him over. It was a caricature of communicative language teaching. The idea is of remixing. Remixing happens everywhere. So we are multiliteracies. This quote unquote new approach is a remix of communicative language teaching with some new elements added. And that's an important element added. It's moving away from the native speaker frame to what multilingualism really is all about.
Right. And another shift then is the notion of comprehension to interpretation. And interpretation can begin at the very beginning of foreign language study. So it's about scaffolding those strategies, and the assessment is that we're looking at is tying into that. Now here we have an important problem. And Swaffer and Ahrens wrote about this and termed it cultural gaps. So, reactions?
So we're going to just scratch it off. And then what happens is that when students actually go to that country and they experience it, they think to themselves, this is not what I learned. Mm-hmm. This is not the culture they presented to me.
Right. So one of two things, in a sense, happens. One is you erase it because you don't want to deal with it. Sort of it doesn't exist. The other is to explicitly, at the outset, explain. Right. So as the teacher or the textbook, you give that information from the outset. But here is really the fascinating part of this and the fascinating part of the study. What are the consequences of the inability to think transculturally? Going back to the MLA report, this notion of transcultural competence. What are the unanticipated consequences of the inability to think transculturally? One would presume that after reading additional text about American wedding practices, the Indian readers would find their earlier inferences inadequate or inappropriate. However, subsequent research on foreign language reading suggests that students resist correction of first impressions, that initial misapprehensions about textual features can become entrenched misreadings. And actually, Swaffer and Ahrens in their textbook provided the tool of, therefore, before a student reads a text, you want to avoid this problem of it becoming a first impression and therefore the possibility of becoming an entrenched misreading, is that you give that information up front and you explain the cultural difference, and therefore when they read the text they can avoid that problem.
So this is a problem with a written text.
Yes.
It's even worse with an oral text,
That's
which
right.
you don't often have time to go back and review. So it depends on what kind of text, but I think it gets worse and worse, right?
Exactly.
If you don't have that ability to go back and review it.
Exactly. So my interest is, along with this idea of FLLITE, the FLLITE approach, being an intuitive approach for teachers who don't have background in the sort of stylistics and linguistics frameworks that can, lead to this sort of an understanding. It's an intuitive approach. You can work with the FLLITE categories of play. You can start looking at language differently, do research in a small scale when you can, et cetera. I'm also interested in developing an intuitive approach for students when it comes to reading, because they're not always going to have a teacher available or a textbook available when they're in the real world who's going to say, oh, by the way, here's a cultural difference. This is this, and it's different from this, so, don't get confused, right? We encounter this all the time. I spent a year in China in 89-90, and I can tell you that all of my reference points were blown off the chart. And my undergraduate major at Barnard and Columbia was Chinese Studies. I went there thinking, oh, okay, I should be able to negotiate or whatever. I was completely blown away by things that I could not understand. I had no way of grappling with. So this has been something I've thought about for many years. Here is a tool that I find very helpful, and it's related to social reading. E-comma is a tool that was developed by COERLL. So essentially, social reading is an internet-based activity in which students collaboratively read, annotate, and comment upon a shared text. So you upload a text to this tool, the e-comma tool, And students will see the text. I didn't provide visuals for it, but you can go to the website and you can check it out. And it generates word clouds, and it has a comment column where students are interacting and interpreting the text and writing their questions and comments, etc. So there are many applications that can be used for social reading. I use eComma because it's open, right? So it's free, and it's also free to be adapted, free to be used and adapted, so you can work with it in a number of different ways.
Anybody here can use it in their courses because it's open, but you can also you can embed it easily in a Blackboard or Canvas or any of your learning management systems. So, but the idea is everybody in the class is reading the text at the same time. And today I showed you the thing Genius.com. So you take a text and have 100 people tagging it and annotating it. That's the concept. It can be any text. You have to turn the text into a digital text, but yeah. This is a web-based program, so you create a space on the web for all your students to go to. There are a lot of programs that do social reading. So you can actually, some programs you can go to the website and you're going to download an app that you can actually tag and annotate the website as it is. This is a little bit different. This is like they all go to this space. So and on this site, the eComma, a space for social reading, we have various tools that you can look and kind of do a comparison shopping. So it's much more about the concept of social reading than it is just eComma. eComma is one tool to use, but there are many tools out there.
But one thing that is nice on the eComma site is that there are case studies. So just as we're asking people like you, once you create a FLLITE lesson, and if you end up teaching your lesson, is to give some kind of feedback to others about what your experience was. There are some case studies, and I wrote one about the use of L1 in introductory level. Just talking about different kinds of things that you can do with texts.
I did that. I also do a social reading. And since everything is digital, I had them, instead of interpret the poem in language, I said, since we had looked at different forms of surrealism, I said they actually went in and they tagged parts of the poem with visual images. So they were interpreting the poem. Instead of using language, they were using all kinds of paintings that this reminds me of. So that's another thing you can do. And then they just went crazy and they said, well, why limit it to images? Why not sounds? And I mean, it kept going on and on and on. So it was a multimodal, multimedia interpretation of the poem.
And actually on the FLLITE website, if you go to the how-to page and down to the resources, you'll also see under assessment tools, you'll see, I'm going to walk you through now the steps that I propose for interpretation strategies in using something like eComma, but let's say for social reading. But you can find this information at that point. Under assessment tools. So what are the strategies that I'm proposing? And again, this is for students for developing a more intuitive sense of when are they coming up against this cultural gap? Because we can't, that's the problem, we can't know, right? So the first strategy is what I call red flagging. So read the text with your gut. Whenever you experience a point of tension, surprise, annoyance, curiosity, disappointment, disapproval, confusion, or emotional distance, flag the word or passage by highlighting it, and then write a comment that identifies your reaction and the source of tension that produced it. So in the eComma, you actually, highlight the word, and it will appear highlighted in the text for other students, and then you write your comment. So I'm saying let's focus, let's work with this notion. So red flag it, identify where are you having a problem, where do you think you might be encountering some kind of gap in comprehension, a gray area of meaning that you can't make sense of. The second step then is questioning the text and assumptions. So read classmates' questions, comments, and think about the points that you have red flagged. What sorts of assumptions might you or your classmates be making? What questions can be raised to help identify a problem, a possible cause, or for tension in comprehension? The third one is then finding evidence. So you've gone through this process, and now it's like, okay, I have something to work with here. So, and because it's an internet-based tool, they have access instantly to internet resources, so I give them ideas. One is actually the word cloud from Eat Comma. There are sometimes interesting things. It includes punctuation. So if punctuation is important, it will show up in the word cloud. And you can actually do some nice things you can focus your students' attention even, or they can look at things, I noticed this and whatever. So the other thing is things like wordref.com, lingy.com, internet, etc. These were things that are multilingual Google searches for cultural historical information. So they can do a little quick search, get some information, and then the idea is to formulate an evidence-based interpretation. So when you have a working interpretation that's founded on evidence, so that means context clues plus supplemental information, share your interpretation, so you can give a definition, a synonym, an explanation with the group, and if you need to, you can cite a resource where necessary. And here, this is key. Do not make guesses about meaning based on what you feel or imagine. That's the trap, because that's our default system. And our default system, on occasion, may be right, but is often wrong. So don't trust what you're feeling. Learn to question that. And then you have, when it comes to rubric, because when we talk about assessment tools, rubrics are now such a useful tool for assessment. Now you put in red flagging, questioning the text and assumptions, finding evidence, formulating evidence-based interpretations, and you can use those basic criteria for giving some kind of, for giving a grade for each of the students. What's nice about eComma is that you can, all of the students who have responded, all of their names are in the eComma site, so you can actually then click on a name and you get all of their comments. So you can actually see what are these students doing based on this. And the next thing then that I want to talk about is writing. I want to touch on with writing. We've talked about some assessment ideas for reading. So the word creativity has come up a lot here, and it's a hot, sort of a hot button word in teaching these days. And a lot of people talk about, let's, and they use it as a criteria in writing. Some teachers will use creativity. But creativity in and of itself is not a skill, right? It's not something that you can assess. You're not giving something that is, I don't want to use the word quantifiable, but it is a little bit that, right? So what is the skill? So again, from one of my chapters in the textbook, we're going to see how if you talk about, with this notion of the literary in the everyday, if you talk about redesign of information via effective play with the targeted literary dimensions that you're working with, you're giving students an idea of the literary in a text. Now you can test how well they apply that, how effectively they work with those literary dimensions, and that becomes a criteria for what you might think of as creativity. How are they redesigning the text based on your the work that they've been doing? So in this particular chapter, does anyone know what a Chinese portrait is? A Chinese portrait is a questionnaire. It's a personality questionnaire that's became very popular in England and the United States in the 1800s. And Proust, who was a real Anglophone, also very interested in British culture, actually filled out one of these questionnaires. And this is in Wikipedia. It's a very kind of well-known thing. So what I found interesting for introductory level students, because we often talk about, right, early levels of language learning, you want students to be able to talk about their likes and dislikes and who they are and get a sense of themselves. Asking questions, however, is rather complicated linguistically. So they haven't yet, so this is in the second chapter, they haven't yet gotten to the point of being able to ask information questions. And what I found so fascinating here, what is foregrounded for me in this sense, is the use of noun phrases and noun clauses as questions. And then all of the answers are in noun phrases or noun clauses. So here we went from introduction of the simple noun to suddenly being able to use noun structures in this very productive way in order to get information about who we are. So instead of saying, the first one, what is the quality that I look for most in a man, or that I appreciate most in a man? It's the quality that I look for in a man. Feminine charms. The quality that I look for most in a woman. Right.
So he wants men to be like women and women to be like
women
men.
to be like men, exactly. So what is wonderful is that it gets them really focused, and this is structured input. You know, if you're thinking about Lee and Van Patten, this is really structured input, but it's getting students to really work productively with these patterns. They're getting the norms, and then how to play with a little bit with those norms to ask questions and to produce answers.
The answers are, you know, what we were talking about yesterday, literary, breaking the norm or unconventional. All of these, his answers are pretty amazing, because it's like, you know, like number 5, my preferred occupation, what I want to do, and the word, of course, the verb to love.
Right. Right.
It's like, yeah, okay.
Exactly.
Yeah, I want that too.
But yeah, so this wonderful Proust, who is giving these answers to a personality questionnaire. So then we get to the writing assignment. So as I was mentioning yesterday, the first half of a lesson, a FLLITE lesson, really focuses on interpretation strategies based on a text. You want to bring out some aspect of language or culture or textual organization that then students are going to be putting into effect in their writing or redesigning. So here, basically, the writing assignment is create a self-portrait in the form of a Chinese portrait and include visualization of some sort, a photograph, a drawing, a chart, a symbolic representation of an aspect of who you are, not a photo of yourself. So I'm getting them to kind of play with imagery that's tying into representing who they are, but without just taking a picture of yourself. Yeah, okay, so now we get down to the specifics. What's the language that they're going to use? What are the criteria that they're going to use? So using the following website and vocabulary from the chapter you're studying, select 8 questions that reveal aspects of your personality, your tastes, and aspirations. So there is a website. It's called Portrait Chinois, and all kinds of people have uploaded their responses and their questions. They create questions for these personality tests, and they also provide answers. And it's this wealth of just fun ideas for how you can get at better understanding who someone is. But B, all of the questions on the site are written in the conditional form. If I were, si j'étais. Now, the very second chapter in introductory level French, we haven't gotten to conditionals. We don't want to go there, right? So C, part of B, rewrite the questions that you choose. So I'm asking them, read these questions, choose 8 that you like, that you want to use for the basis of your own questionnaire, and rewrite those in this noun phrase or clause form that we've looked at. Write brief answers to the questions using a variety of noun forms as outlined in whatever. And for longer answers, include the use of punctuation to link some of your ideas. And I do introduce some basic information about punctuation, which has to do with the comma difference between French and English. You can use a comma in French to connect clauses, which in English you cannot. You could use a semicolon. And in fact, the comma functions very much like a semicolon to connect clauses. Then the next step, when students have written their first draft, I give them peer editing tasks to do, which are then going to form the basis for the criteria for grading. So I'm getting them into editing, but in a way that is tying into interpretation and language. And so the first task here has to do with topic development. Is there sufficient descriptive information in the text for you to come away with a clear picture of the writer? Is there too much information, thus clouding the picture? Try to identify areas that need expanding or clarification or streamlining. Because obviously they create a questionnaire and then they give it to a partner to give the answers, right? Then techniques used for linking ideas. So here has to do with this punctuation. Underline all the instances of the use of a comma to connect nouns or adjectives or clauses in the answer. In cases where a comma is used to link clauses, I can't read this very well, sorry. Do the sentences appropriately express a juxtaposition of information? In other words, is the use of the comma justified? I also added here avoiding literal translations from English. You could read that, and then also the use of symbolic visual representation. So they're not just reading. What happens, and there's been a lot of research about what happens when students peer edit. And what do they do? Left to their own devices, you say, okay, read your partner's text. What do they do? Well, they don't always say it looks good, although there is that sense of wanting to be, they don't want to be too challenging sometimes. They do grammar correction and spelling. That's it. Overwhelmingly, research shows that students left to their own devices, when they think, okay, I'm supposed to edit this or look at it and give feedback, it's all about grammar and spelling. So here I'm giving them very specific tasks to get them thinking about how meaning is made in the text and how successful it is. And then when we come to the rubric, I use that topic development, accuracy of use of noun forms, techniques for linking ideas, And so there's no surprise. The students have already been working with the criteria. They know what the expectations are. And so that's what it's graded on.
So I have a question. Yeah. You in your textbook, you're using examples from your textbook,
right.
But you don't have these rubrics in there. They're not part of the lesson.
I do. I have in the very beginning. So I have a teacher's guide that I wrote for it. And at the end of the teacher's guide, I give a kind of master that is just a rubric. But the idea then is, so this is very important. You cannot use one rubric for all of your writing assignments,
right.
Which is what a lot of teachers do. For each writing assignment, because you're going to have very specific tasks and criteria based on whatever you're bringing out as the literary in that text, you have to create a new rubric for every writing task. And so all you do is just use the basic format, and then you just change the criteria. And I explain in the teacher's guide, the criteria that you use for the peer writing task is exactly what you're going to plug in as criteria for the rubric. As
part of your lesson, you could attach all these rubrics as kind of an appendix, or saying, and this is how I test this, or this is what I do. You have a whole textbook, right?
Right.
But everybody here is just doing a lesson.
Right.
And yet they may have something like a rubric or something in their head.
I see.
All I'm saying is that you've written for two audiences, and they probably are too. So go ahead and if you want to have a teacher, all I'm saying is if you want to talk to the teacher, talk explicitly to the teacher, okay?
I see what you're saying.
Yeah. There might be things that you want to say to the teachers, like in this step, and, tell your students.
Okay, so that in fact, that's it for...
We gave you 4 pedagogical acts, and she's given you some information. You don't have to, this is not an orthodoxy. You don't have to follow every single step. We still want you to be creative, but there are general principles to think about. So you start with experiencing a text, which is pretty easy to do. But that's not where they want to end up. You want to have them develop and start to interpret a text, and this has to be scaffolded. So think about the basic principle is to get them to reread, that you don't have them read a text only one time and then answer questions. You want them to go over text in different ways, so focus their attention in different ways. And then move from reading to writing. Think about all the 4 skills and that kind of thing, okay?